Welcome back to SA Today. Now, Egypt and Turkey have announced that they will join South Africa's case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. South Africa has accused Israel of violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention in its war in the Gaza Strip. Now, the announcement comes as Pretoria has requested the ICJ to impose extra measures against Israel, and Israel has, of course, rejected the accusations, saying it respects international law and has a right to defend itself. Meanwhile, support for Palestinians is growing at universities and colleges across the world. Let's now welcome Professor Andre Thomas-Hausen from UNISA. Prof, great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. So do you think this latest move by Turkey as well as Egypt joining South Africa's case will actually strengthen as well as put even more pressure for the desired outcome, which is that immediate ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, yes, of course. The mood in the world has changed, and there is now some impatience. We see that even Israel's longest standing and most unconditional ally, the United States, has stopped the supply of ammunition and has threatened to cut support. The pictures are a bit unbearable. Gaza is in ruins, and the prospect of the last area in the south also being reduced to rubble is just weighing heavily on the world conscience. Except we have to realize that South Africa's interventions in the International Court of Justice so far haven't saved a single life. They came at a big cost to South Africa because our relations with our main trading partners, with Europe and America and Canada, Australia and New Zealand, have been tarnished by this. And we mustn't forget that we depend on them, not just for trade, but for a lot of aid. It's about $400 million a year that America gives to help us help the 8 million HIV positive people in South Africa. So we are brave. I think the anti-apartheid conference this last weekend has praised South Africa for standing out alone amongst so many countries in its activism, judicial activism against Israel.
I'm glad that you mentioned that ammunition assistance there, Prof, because I'm wondering, looking at the countries that remain in full support of Israel, be it with that ammunition or financial support, what do you anticipate the geopolitical or legal implications could be in that instance?
The law is really a bit helpless in a conflict like this. This is a major, a big conflict, and it was triggered by a very outrageous act of barbarism on the 7th of October. We should not forget that the ANC, during the decades of anti-apartheid struggle, never decided to for instance, go and massacre over 1,000 people in what was then called Pretoria and celebrate it. So this outrage, the legal order doesn't really have instruments to help control it, except, of course, there is one measure that the United Nations Security Council has not yet considered, and not even South Africa has thrown it into this debate, which would be a United Nations peacekeeping mission with a multinational force to be stationed in Gaza and to basically then act as an international shield against further bombing. And of course, South Africa is about to withdraw 2 battalions from North Mozambique, and they could be transferred to Gaza easily at the same cost.
Look, Prof, what should we make then? I know you made reference to it, the Global Anti-Apartheid Conference, but we do know that, of course, the Hamas delegation actually arrived in South Africa on Saturday to participate in that Global Anti-Apartheid Conference. What do you think, where does this put us or posture us as a country?
Well, I'm not happy with it, but then many will disagree with me because I feel South Africa is making the same mistake that the NATO countries are doing in the Ukraine conflict. South Africa's action in support, one-sidedly, of Hamas is fueling the conflict. It is like weaponizing Hamas. Whether you send arms or you lend major ideological support, ends up in the same thing. It inflames. And South Africa should better use its very good access with Hamas to try and diffuse this situation, to try and bring reason to the table, to try and discuss the origin of the conflict, which is the fact that the hostages are still being held under atrocious conditions, and that daily there are still missiles being fired against civilian targets in Israel. Just now, the latest news are that there's fierce fighting between Hamas fighters and the Israeli Defense Force in all sorts of areas in Gaza. So the war is far from being de-escalated and from being slowly, gradually taking across into a situation of negotiation and seeking of a more lasting solution, including, of course, a ceasefire.
And Prof, do you think this international justice system is actually without sufficient teeth? We know that a long time ago, the ICC was actually asked to investigate the situation in Gaza. There hasn't been any decisive action in that regard. And of course, we know with the recent developments there, the US says any threats of imprisonment to Israel leaders would be met with hostility. I mean, how then will this situation be effectively dealt with, you think?
Well, the international legal order, because there's no international government, is always very imperfect. It is a set of standards that have developed through state practice and some treaties, some written law, but the sovereignty of states, the equal sovereignty of all states, makes it impossible to have enforcement mechanisms unless there is a universal consensus, unless all the permanent members in the United Nations Security Council should agree to that. And this is why I'm saying the UN Security Council could agree on dispatching a United Nations peacekeeping and security force, a multinational force. There are many precedents. It happened in the Korea War. It happened until very recently in the DRC. It happened very successfully in the very bloody Mozambican civil war. So this is possible. But for some reason, nobody is suggesting it. And South Africa is a little bit alone. There are over 242 nations, and we have to ask ourselves, could it be that they're all wrong and we are the only nation that is on the right path? I doubt it. I question it.
And in closing, Prof, speaking of those suggestions, we've seen, of course, a lot of protests against Benjamin Netanyahu's defined rule, of course, with big-time allies like Biden. In serious question, I mean, we know that some of these protests have actually gained momentum across the globe. So would sanctions not then be a logical deterrent to Netanyahu's arrogance?
Maybe, but we've seen in the Ukraine conflict that the sanctions are very ineffective. Russia's economy grew more than any other economy in the world during the sanctions and despite the sanctions. So the sanctions are a very blunt instrument, but they will provoke a hardening of extreme attitudes in the targeted country. Just like Russia became more intransigent and refused even more to compromise on anything after the sanctions were imposed, so would in Israel the very right-wing parties, the very nationalist parties gain the upper hand if the pressure from outside increases. So I think there are these undertones also in our South African statements that, of course, we need to find a way to get the warring parties to start discussing the future, to start accepting that they have to coexist. The Palestine people cannot possibly dream of extinguishing the entire population of Israel, and Israel cannot possibly attempt to extinguish the Palestine people. They have to learn to coexist.
Great analysis there. Thank you so much for your time. That is, of course, Professor Andre Thomas-Hausen there from UNISA weighing in on the situation in Gaza. And at the latest, there is that Egypt, Turkey, as well as Colombia have since joined the case by South Africa to the International Court of Justice.